Welcome, dear reader, to a journey through the fascinating world of medieval myths, legends, and long-held beliefs that history has finally confirmed. This story is not about fanciful tales alone, but about the truths hidden behind centuries of storytelling, rumor, and skepticism. From knights and castles to mysterious diseases, forgotten technologies, and social customs, the medieval era is rich with myths that have shaped our understanding of the past. Some were considered mere folklore, while others were dismissed by historians as exaggerations, until modern research, archaeology, and science confirmed their authenticity. In the following chapters, we will explore these medieval truths in detail: the actual existence of legendary weapons, the reality behind mystical phenomena, and the surprising practices of daily life that were once thought impossible. Knights, often romanticized as gallant figures, were in reality disciplined warriors with specialized armor and training. Modern archaeological findings confirm that suits of armor were highly functional, designed not only for protection, but also for mobility and endurance during battle. The long-believed myth that knights could not move in full armor was debunked. Experimental archaeology has shown that well-fitted plate armor allowed a knight to run, mount a horse, and wield weapons effectively. Training regimes, diet, and physical conditioning were integral, challenging the notion that medieval warriors were clumsy or weak. Stories of enormous siege engines and fearsome weapons have often been considered exaggerations. Yet excavations and historical manuscripts prove the existence of gigantic trebuchets, massive crossbows, and even chemical warfare using primitive gunpowder mixtures. The myths of flaming projectiles, catapults hurling enormous stones, and fortified castles surviving prolonged sieges are based in reality. Detailed studies of medieval military treatises reveal the sophistication and ingenuity behind these constructions, confirming that the tales were not mere exaggerations but reflections of advanced medieval engineering. The Middle Ages have long been associated with disease, superstition, and primitive medicine. For centuries, historians and laypeople alike assumed that medieval medical knowledge was crude, mostly rooted in religious ritual or fear. Yet modern research has proven that many practices, once dismissed as myths, were grounded in observation, trial, and surprisingly sophisticated understanding of the human body and disease. The reality of the Black Death. The myth that the Black Death spread only because people were ignorant is partly true, but not entirely. Contemporary chronicles describe patterns of infection that align with modern epidemiology. Recent studies of skeletal remains and DNA analysis of Yersinia pestis confirm that the plague spread rapidly through both fleas and human carriers. Medieval physicians attempted quarantine, isolation, and hygiene practices that were remarkably effective, even without understanding germs. Port cities instituted rudimentary checks on travelers and cargo. Monastic hospitals enforced cleanliness and separation of patients. These measures, once thought mythic or symbolic, are now recognized as early forms of epidemiological practice. Herbal remedies and folk medicine, herbs, roots, and plants, often dismissed as superstition, were integral to medieval healing. Modern pharmacology confirms that medieval herbal remedies contained active compounds. Willow bark, used for fever and pain, contained salicin, the chemical basis of modern aspirin. Garlic, onion, and other plants had antibacterial and antiviral properties. Records from apothecaries and monasteries indicate careful preparation, dosage control, and observation of efficacy. Far from mere ritual, these remedies demonstrate empirical knowledge passed down through generations. The myth that medieval medicine was wholly ineffective is thus debunked. It was partially limited by available knowledge, but often surprisingly functional. Surgery, amputation, and prosthetics. The myth that medieval surgeons were barbaric or unskilled is only partially accurate. Archaeological evidence of surgical tools, trepanning, skull operations, and prosthetic limbs shows advanced practical knowledge. Some patients survived amputations or cranial surgeries, indicating careful technique, antiseptic methods with alcohol or wine, and pain management using herbs. Prosthetic devices made of iron, wood, or leather, including articulated hands and legs, prove that attempts to restore functionality were surprisingly successful. Patients often returned to daily life, challenging the myth that disability in medieval times was invariably debilitating. Plague doctors and their masks. The iconic plague doctor with beaked mask and long robes is often dismissed as theatrical myth, yet historical evidence confirms that these masks, filled with aromatic herbs, served a functional purpose. Physicians believe miasmas cause disease, and while incorrect scientifically, the herbs filtered some airborne pathogens. Protective clothing also reduced direct exposure to infected fluids. Hospitals, hygiene, and public health. Medieval hospitals, often thought primitive, were centers of care, education, and sanitation. Monastic communities enforced hand-washing, clean linens, and controlled access. Some cities instituted public health measures, waste management, clean water, and pest control. These efforts contradict the myth that medieval populations lived in filth without any organized response to disease. Myths debunked by archaeology. Excavations reveal that medieval communities had knowledge of ventilation, dietary health, and sanitation. For example, latrine design, water channels, and disposal pits were sophisticated enough to reduce contamination. Archaeologists found remnants of herbal gardens associated with hospitals, confirming the intentional cultivation of medicinal plants. The role of women in medicine. Contrary to myths of male-dominated medical practice, women played crucial roles as herbalists, midwives, and healers. Manuscripts reference female practitioners, their recipes, and treatment protocols. These women contributed substantially to public health, especially in childbirth and family care, demonstrating the social importance of women in medicine. Conclusions on medical myths. Many assumptions about medieval medicine as ineffective superstition are myths themselves. While constrained by limited scientific knowledge, medieval physicians, herbalists, and healers developed practical methods for treatment, prevention, and public health. Modern validation of these practices, from herbal remedies to early quarantine measures, reveals a sophisticated understanding of human health within the historical context. The image of medieval castles, towering stone fortresses, and impregnable walls has long been romanticized and mythologized. Stories of castles surviving massive sieges, secret tunnels, and hidden weapons were dismissed by some historians as exaggerated folklore. Modern archaeology and research, however, confirm that these structures and defensive strategies were as sophisticated and sometimes as terrifying as the legend suggested. The architecture of defense. Castles were not merely symbols of power. They were functional defensive structures designed for real combat scenarios. Thick stone walls, towers, moats, and battlements were carefully calculated to resist artillery and invaders. Archaeological surveys reveal the precise angles of walls, placement of arrow slits, and layering of fortifications to optimize defense. Some castles contain concentric walls, a design where one defensive wall was surrounded by another, creating layers that slowed attackers and increased the defender's advantage. The myth that castles were simple stone boxes is entirely false. They were military engineering marvels, built with careful planning and advanced knowledge of geometry and materials. Siege engines and weaponry. Stories of enormous trebuchets, massive catapults, and fearsome battering rams are grounded in reality. Excavations have confirmed the presence of massive timber structures, stone projectiles, and reinforced mechanisms capable of hurling objects over long distances. The myth that medieval soldiers fought only with swords and spears overlooks the sophistication of their siege technology. Some sieges lasted months, testing both engineering and human endurance. The defenders relied on clever tactics, dropping boiling water, tar, or rocks from walls, and utilizing counterweights and trapdoors. Archaeological evidence of catapult stones, fire pots, and defensive trenches validates these historical accounts. Secret passages and tunnels. Many legends speak of secret tunnels and hidden escape routes within castles. While some stories were exaggerated, archaeological findings confirm that castles often included concealed passages for messengers, supply routes, or emergency exits. These tunnels were strategically designed, sometimes leading outside the castle walls to avoid detection. The myth that these passages were purely fictional is debunked by modern surveying and ground-penetrating radar, revealing hidden chambers, escape routes, and storage vaults. The role of nobility and soldiers. The myth of lazy or ineffective medieval nobility is contradicted by records of castle commanders, knights, and soldiers who were highly trained in strategy, logistics, and martial discipline. Knights were expected to maintain proficiency in combat, horseback riding, and weapons handling. Their effectiveness in battle was not dependent solely on luck or brute strength, but on rigorous training, diet, and tactical understanding. Noble households within castles were centers of administration, military planning, and supply distribution. They coordinated with local villages, farmers, and trade networks to ensure resources during prolonged sieges. This management disproves the idea that medieval fortresses were isolated and chaotic during conflicts. Daily life within fortifications. Life inside castles was not only about warfare. Daily routines included maintaining the fortifications, training soldiers, tending livestock, and preparing food. Kitchens were functional, often with large hearths, ovens, and storage rooms. Archaeological findings of cooking pots, grains, and preserved foods illustrate the logistical sophistication needed to sustain large populations during conflict. The myth that castle life was purely opulent entertainment is partly false. While nobles enjoyed luxuries, the majority of life involved careful planning, resource management, and preparation for emergencies. Servants, craftsmen, and soldiers all contributed to sustaining the complex ecosystem of castle life. Defensive innovations. Some castles incorporated innovative defensive measures, such as machicolations, overhanging platforms with openings for dropping projectiles, murder holes, drawbridges, and portcullises. These innovations were not myth, but intentional designs to repel attackers. Archaeologists have identified early uses of gunpowder in castle defense, demonstrating that medieval engineers experimented with emerging technology long before it became widespread. Even simple features, such as angle walls and strategic placement of towers, illustrate the integration of architectural theory with practical defense. Psychological warfare. The mythology of terrorizing invaders with dragons or mythical beasts was less fantasy than clever psychological warfare. Gargoyles, statues, and elaborate fortifications projected power and intimidation, deterring potential attackers. The myth that these symbols were purely decorative is disproved by their intentional use to convey authority, fear, and dominance. Legacy of medieval fortifications. The careful planning, engineering, and innovation of medieval castles had a lasting impact on military architecture. Modern studies of fortifications in Ireland, England, and continental Europe reveal lessons in resource allocation, structural engineering, and tactical planning. These fortresses were more than military installations. They were symbols of human ingenuity, social organization, and resilience in times of conflict. The myths surrounding them, while often exaggerated, were grounded in truth and reflect a historical reality far more complex than previously imagined. The Middle Ages were often depicted as a period dominated by superstition, blind faith, and ignorance. Many myths and legends of the era have persisted for centuries, portraying medieval people as credulous and irrational. However, modern research shows that much of what was dismissed as fantasy was grounded in genuine belief systems, empirical observations, or symbolic representation of real phenomena. Monasteries as centers of knowledge. Contrary to the myth that medieval monks were isolated and solely devoted to prayer, monasteries were hubs of learning, medicine, agriculture, and technology. Manuscripts reveal that monks meticulously copied texts on astronomy, mathematics, and natural sciences, preserving knowledge that would have otherwise been lost. Archaeological discoveries show that monastic gardens were carefully cultivated for medicinal herbs and experimental agriculture. The myth that medieval religious communities ignored practical life is disproven. Monks were deeply involved in daily management, experimentation, and observation, blending spiritual devotion with practical application. Miracles and scientific explanation. Many medieval miracles, once considered purely supernatural, are now understood to reflect natural phenomena or human ingenuity. For example, reports of incorruptible saints' bodies are sometimes explained by environmental factors or embalming practices. Pilgrimages, miraculous healings, and divine visions often coincided with psychosomatic responses, herbal remedies, or other medically relevant practices. The legend of saints performing miraculous healings may contain kernels of truth. Some religious practitioners employed early forms of hygiene, herbal medicine, or minor surgical interventions. While the spiritual framing remains, the underlying acts often had tangible effects on health and well-being. Alchemy and protochemistry. Alchemy has long been dismissed as mystical charlatanry, but recent studies reveal that medieval alchemists conducted systematic experiments with metals, acids, and compounds. The search for gold, while symbolic, Also advanced knowledge of chemical reactions, distillation, and metallurgy. Medieval texts demonstrate an early understanding of processes that resemble modern chemistry. The myth that alchemists were merely charlatans ignores their careful observations, experimental records, and contributions to technology. Many techniques they developed, such as distillation and fermentation, were precursors to later scientific discoveries. Astrology and astronomy. Astrology, often ridiculed as superstition, was closely linked to early astronomy. Medieval scholars meticulously recorded celestial movements, constructed calendars, and predicted eclipses. Observations once considered mystical were based on precise measurements and calculations. The myth that medieval astronomers were purely fantastical ignores their empirical methods. Instruments such as astrolabes, quadrants, and armillary spheres were used to chart the stars, aiding navigation, agriculture, and the timing of religious festivals. Astrology was intertwined with astronomy, not merely a form of entertainment or divination. Witchcraft and folk beliefs. Legends of witches, magic, and curses have colored our view of medieval Europe. Modern scholarship reveals that many supposed witchcraft incidents were rooted in social tensions, misunderstandings of natural phenomena, or medical conditions. For instance, hallucinations caused by ergot-infected rye could produce visions interpreted as demonic encounters. Herbs and potions once labeled magical were often based on pharmacological properties. The myth that medieval folk entirely misunderstood nature is therefore nuanced. Folk practices sometimes preserve practical knowledge through symbolic or ritualistic frameworks. The role of pilgrimages. Pilgrimages were seen as pious journeys, often surrounded by tales of miracles. Archaeological evidence shows that pilgrims sometimes brought back seeds, plants, or medicinal substances, contributing to cultural and biological exchange. The myth that pilgrimages were purely religious adventures overlooks their social, economic, and practical functions. Pilgrims acted as carriers of information, technology, and culture, bridging distant regions and facilitating the spread of knowledge. Relics and religious artifacts. The fascination with relics, from bones of saints to fragments of the true cross, was long seen as credulity. Modern studies reveal that many relics were carefully documented, preserved, and sometimes used to attract pilgrimage and commerce. While some claims were exaggerated, the physical preservation techniques demonstrate advanced knowledge of materials, conservation, and symbolic display. Conclusion on medieval mysticism. The medieval period was far more intellectually and empirically sophisticated than often assumed. Mystical practices, religious rituals, and legends were embedded in systems of observation, practical knowledge, and social cohesion. Myths once dismissed as pure fantasy often contained elements of truth, reflecting a complex worldview that blended faith, empirical observation, and cultural symbolism. Medieval religion and mysticism were not simply about superstition. They were deeply intertwined with knowledge, experimentation, and the human drive to understand the world, laying groundwork for later scientific thought. The Middle Ages are filled with legendary figures whose lives were often transformed into myths. From valiant kings and cunning queens to warriors and scholars, their stories have been romanticized, exaggerated, or dismissed as folklore. Modern research, archaeology, and the critical examination of manuscripts, however, have confirmed the existence and actions of many of these figures, separating historical truth from legend. King Arthur and the Celtic mythos. One of the most enduring myths is that of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. While the legendary battles and magical elements remain mythical, archaeological evidence and historical research suggest that a chieftain or warrior leader named Arthur likely existed in post-Roman Britain. Artifacts, fortifications, and regional chronicles indicate military campaigns consistent with descriptions in medieval literature. Sites such as Tintagel Castle and Cadbury Castle have revealed layers of occupation and defense that align with the legendary timeline. These findings demonstrate that the myth of Arthur may have been built on real leadership, political intrigue, and warfare, even if the tales were later embellished with chivalric romance. Joan of Arc, myth and reality. The story of Joan of Arc, often viewed through a lens of divine inspiration, has long included elements of myth regarding visions, military prowess, and martyrdom. Modern historical analysis confirms many aspects of her story. Her leadership in the French army, the pivotal battles she influenced, and the political motivations surrounding her trial. Contemporary documents, letters, and court records validate her extraordinary impact at a young age, proving that many legendary accounts were based on real events. The mythologized narrative surrounding Joan underscores how fact and legend can intertwine in medieval storytelling. Richard the Lionheart and Crusader legends. Richard I of England, known as Richard the Lionheart, has often been depicted as a near-mythical warrior king. Chroniclers portrayed his bravery, chivalry, and martial skill in exaggerated terms. Archaeological evidence of fortresses, military campaigns, and armaments confirms the reality behind these tales. While some embellishments exist, Richard's strategic acumen, battlefield leadership, and political influence were real. The myths, when examined critically, reveal kernels of historical truth regarding medieval warfare, diplomacy, and the persona of a crusading monarch. Viking raiders and northern myths. Viking raids on England, Ireland, and France are legendary, often depicted as sudden, destructive, and merciless. Excavations, ship burials, and coastal fortifications validate these accounts. Artifacts, longships, and settlement remains confirm the myths about Viking navigation, raiding strategies, and the scale of their impact. However, the Viking era also included trade, settlement, and cultural exchange. The myth of purely violent invaders ignores their role in shaping medieval Europe's economic and cultural landscape. Evidence shows a nuanced picture. Raiders and settlers, warriors and merchants, all contributing to history in ways once considered purely legendary. Mystical scholars and alchemists. Legends of mystical scholars, from Roger Bacon to Albertus Magnus, often include mythic accounts of magical experiments or prophetic knowledge. Historical records reveal these figures as pioneers of empirical investigation. Bacon's work on optics, alchemy, and early experimental methods confirmed that elements of the mystical narrative were grounded in real scientific inquiry. Albertus Magnus, once rumored to possess mystical powers, actually conducted meticulous observations and experiments. Many miracles attributed to these scholars were later understood as early scientific discoveries. The blending of myth and empirical evidence illustrates how medieval society often framed scientific achievement in mystical terms. Saints and legendary pilgrimages. The tales of saints performing miracles, walking on water, or healing the sick are often considered pure legend. Yet some accounts are verified by historical documents, archaeological findings, and natural explanations. For example, sites of pilgrimages have yielded artifacts, preserved structures, and remains indicating mass gatherings, ritual practices, and communal care. Some miraculous healing accounts may reflect the beneficial effects of herbs, hygiene, or psychosomatic response. While framed within spiritual narratives, the underlying truth reveals a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and health. Women in medieval history. Myths about women's roles in the Middle Ages often emphasize subjugation or passivity. Research and historical records show that women could wield power, influence trade, manage estates, and even lead armies in exceptional cases. Figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine demonstrate political acumen, cultural patronage, and strategic diplomacy. Archaeological evidence, such as estate records, seals, and artifacts, confirms that women participated actively in economic, social, and even military spheres, challenging the myth of female passivity. Conclusion on legendary figures. The blending of myth and history in the Middle Ages reflects a society where storytelling, moral instruction, and historical recording intertwined. By examining material evidence, contemporary documents, and archaeological findings, many legendary figures once thought purely mythical are now recognized as historical actors. These truths reveal a medieval world more complex, organized, and dynamic than often portrayed, where myths were both imaginative storytelling and reflections of real historical events. The common image of the Middle Ages as a dark period devoid of scientific progress is one of the most persistent myths about the era. While it is true that the period lacks some modern scientific methods, medieval Europe saw remarkable advances in engineering, astronomy, medicine, and technology. Many of these accomplishments were long dismissed as exaggerated or fictional until modern research confirmed their reality. Engineering marvels. Medieval engineers designed bridges, aqueducts, and water mills that rivaled later structures. Stone bridges crossing deep rivers, some of which still stand today, demonstrate sophisticated understanding of weight distribution, arch construction, and material properties. Water mills and windmills were more than simple devices for grinding grain. They represented complex mechanical systems employing gears, pulleys, and levers. Archaeological discoveries of early gears, water wheels, and mill foundations confirm the accuracy of medieval texts describing these machines. The myth that medieval engineering was primitive is entirely unfounded. Medieval clocks and timekeeping. The invention and spread of mechanical clocks is another example of medieval ingenuity. Early clocks, often installed in churches or public towers, required precise craftsmanship, weight-driven mechanisms, and careful calibration. Historians once thought such devices were simple approximations, but surviving examples, along with written records, show that medieval clockmakers achieved remarkable accuracy. Astronomical clocks, incorporating lunar and solar cycles, were practical and educational tools, blending science, craftsmanship, and art. Astronomy and navigation. The study of the heavens was both a scientific and practical pursuit. Medieval astronomers charted stars, predicted eclipses, and developed calendars with remarkable precision. Instruments like astrolabes, quadrants, and armillary spheres were used not only for astrology, but also for navigation and agriculture. Explorers and sailors relied on these instruments to traverse seas with increasing accuracy. The myth that medieval navigation was purely guesswork is disproven by surviving ship logs, astronomical tables, and maritime instruments. Metallurgy and weapon technology. Medieval blacksmiths developed metallurgy techniques that produced durable weapons, armor, and tools. The myth that knights' armor was cumbersome and ineffective ignores metallurgical evidence, showing balanced, flexible, and protective designs. Swords, maces, and crossbows were crafted with sophisticated understanding of alloys, tempering, and structural integrity. Archaeological finds reveal high-quality steel, carefully folded and hardened, capable of withstanding combat stresses. Siege weapons, including trebuchets and ballistae, incorporated physics principles like leverage and counterweight systems, proving medieval engineers had practical knowledge that rivals modern mechanics. Water management and urban planning. Cities in medieval Europe developed advanced systems of water management, including aqueducts, wells, and sewer channels. Excavations reveal stone-lined drains, reservoirs, and conduits that controlled flooding, supplied water, and facilitated sanitation. These findings challenge the myth that medieval urban areas were uniformly unsanitary or primitive. Public health initiatives, waste management, and water engineering were remarkably effective for their time. Agricultural innovations. Medieval farmers implemented crop rotation, selective breeding, and new plowing techniques. The heavy plow and horse collar revolutionized farming in northern Europe, allowing heavier soils to be tilled efficiently. Archaeobotanical studies confirm the use of legumes, grains, and nitrogen-fixing crops in rotation systems, demonstrating sophisticated knowledge of soil fertility. Medieval medicine and instruments. Medical instruments, including surgical tools, bone drills, and prosthetics, showcase both innovation and precision. Many practices once considered mythical or superstitious, such as trepanning, were carried out successfully and sometimes improved patients' conditions. The myth that medieval science was entirely rudimentary fails when compared to surviving texts, artifacts, and evidence of empirical experimentation. Monks, physicians, and alchemists experimented with chemicals, observed natural processes, and recorded results, laying the groundwork for the Renaissance. Printing and knowledge dissemination. Before Gutenberg, scribes meticulously copied manuscripts, preserving and disseminating knowledge. The development of block printing in parts of Europe and Asia allowed broader access to texts, challenging the notion that knowledge was restricted to elites. The myth of a completely knowledge-impoverished Middle Ages ignores both the physical preservation of classical texts and the innovative ways medieval society transmitted information. Libraries, monastic scriptoria, and early printing methods ensure that scientific, medical, and literary knowledge survived. Conclusion on medieval innovation. The Middle Ages were a period of creativity, experimentation, and practical problem-solving. Many achievements once dismissed as myths, mechanical clocks, engineering marvels, urban planning, agricultural techniques, and medical instruments, are now proven realities. Far from a dark age, medieval Europe was a time of technological ingenuity, laying the foundation for the scientific and industrial revolutions to come. Myths surrounding medieval science often stem from underestimation or misunderstanding. When studied closely, the truth reveals an era rich in discovery and innovation. The Middle Ages are often depicted as a time of feudal oppression, limited trade, and simple subsistence living. While the period of stark social hierarchies and agricultural economies, recent research demonstrates that medieval commerce, urban life, and economic organization were far more complex and innovative than commonly imagined. Many myths surrounding medieval trade and daily life are now proven to be only partially true or completely false. Markets and urban centers. Contrary to the myth that medieval towns were chaotic or lawless, cities often had organized markets with regulated trading hours, standardized weights and measures, and guild oversight. Merchants operated under legal frameworks, paying taxes, fees, and tariffs. Evidence from town charters and archaeological excavations shows that marketplaces were central to social, economic, and political life. Merchants traded not only food but textiles, metalwork, pottery, and luxury goods, connecting regions over long distances. The myth that medieval commerce was purely local subsistence is debunked by records of long-distance trade with the Mediterranean, Northern Europe, and even the Middle East. Guilds and craftsmanship. The legend that medieval artisans were unskilled or worked only under exploitive conditions overlooks the sophistication of guild systems. Guilds regulated training, production standards, pricing, and quality control. Archaeological evidence of workshops, tools, and finished goods confirms a high level of craftsmanship. Guilds also serve social functions, providing charity, education, and community leadership. The myth that all medieval labor was manual and unsystematic ignores the structured apprenticeship programs and organized craftsmanship that flourished across Europe, trade networks, and international commerce. Medieval Europe was far from isolated. Trade routes connected Flanders, Italy, the Hanseatic League cities, and even distant lands such as Constantinople, North Africa, and the Levant. Luxuries such as silk, spices, glassware, and precious metals traveled thousands of miles, defying myths of a purely local medieval economy. Evidence from coins, shipping records, and port excavations confirms the existence of sophisticated supply chains. Maritime trade involved advanced shipbuilding techniques, navigation instruments, and commercial contracts that foreshadowed modern economic systems. Currency, banking, and credit. Another myth portrays medieval commerce as a barter-only system. In reality, coinage was widespread, and banking practices emerged in Italian city-states. Letters of credit, promissory notes, and accounting methods allowed merchants to conduct complex transactions over vast distances. Archaeological finds of coins, ledgers, and trade agreements reveal a sophisticated financial network. While the monetary system was not as uniform as today's, it was highly functional and enabled large-scale trade. Rural life and peasant economy. Peasants, often portrayed as living in abject poverty, had more nuanced lives than folklore suggests. Many peasants participated in local trade, maintained small livestock, and cultivated diverse crops. Archaeological studies of rural settlements, tools, and food storage show careful planning, knowledge of soil, and seasonal scheduling. The myth of the wholly oppressed peasant overlooks their agency, communal organization, and survival strategies. Villagers engaged in cooperative labor, shared resources, and adapted to environmental challenges with practical ingenuity. Medieval food and diet. Contrary to myths of a monotonous, meager diet, medieval people ate a variety of foods, adjusted seasonally and regionally. Archaeobotanical evidence reveals consumption of grains, legumes, vegetables, dairy, fish, and meats. Preservation techniques, such as salting, smoking, and pickling, extended food availability. Banquets for the nobility displayed extraordinary culinary skill, while peasant diets were hearty and diverse within economic limits. Herbs, spices, and imported goods occasionally supplemented local fare, demonstrating culinary sophistication that contradicts the myth of simple, bland medieval meals. Transportation and infrastructure. Medieval roads, bridges, and river transport facilitated trade and communication. The myth that medieval travel was perilous and impossible for commerce ignores the extensive network of rivers, canals, and maintained roadways connecting towns and cities. Ferries, carts, and pack animals enabled movement of goods, people, and information. Postal systems, relay stations, and road markers, confirmed through historical documents, further illustrate a medieval infrastructure more organized and popularly imagined. Cultural and intellectual life. Beyond trade and subsistence, medieval urban centers were hubs of culture, education, and intellectual exchange. Universities emerged in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, fostering scholarship in law, theology, medicine, and philosophy. Public readings, debates, and manuscript copying preserved and disseminated knowledge. The myth that the Middle Ages were intellectually stagnant is disproven by evidence of vibrant urban, scholarly, and cultural life. Learning, commerce, and artistic production thrived in tandem, revealing a dynamic society far more complex than stereotypes suggest. Conclusion on commerce and daily life. Medieval Europe was neither uniformly backward nor solely subsistence-based. Markets, guilds, trade networks, financial systems, and urban planning demonstrate organizational sophistication. Rural communities practice effective agriculture, resource management, and trade. Daily life was structured, diverse, and supported by economic and social systems that modern scholarship is only now fully appreciating. The myths of universal poverty, ignorance, and isolation obscure the reality. The Middle Ages were a time of dynamic economic activity, cultural exchange, and practical innovation that shaped the foundations of the modern world. The Middle Ages are often imagined as a period of endless barbaric warfare, ruled by brute force and chaos. Popular myths paint knights as reckless, peasants as powerless, and battles as disorderly. Yet modern scholarship, archaeology, and analysis of military treatises reveal a complex, highly organized world of strategy, logistics, and innovation. The reality of medieval armies. Contrary to the myth of disorganized masses, medieval armies were structured with hierarchy, discipline, and specialized roles. Infantry, cavalry, archers, siege engineers, and support staff worked in coordinated units. Commanders meticulously planned campaigns, supply lines, and troop movements. Documents such as muster rolls, payrolls, and chronicles demonstrate systematic recruitment, training, and deployment. Archaeological evidence of camps, fortifications, and battlefield remains supports the accuracy of these records. The myth that medieval armies were chaotic mobs is simply false. Siege warfare and defensive engineering. Castles and fortified towns were central to medieval military strategy. Siege warfare was both brutal and methodical. Attackers employed trebuchets, mangonels, battering rams, and mining techniques, often over months. Defenders used arrow slits, machicolations, and layered walls to maximize defense. Excavations revealed tunnels, siege ramps, and remnants of defensive structures that confirm chroniclers' accounts. The myth of hopelessly one-sided castle sieges is contradicted by evidence of sophisticated fortifications and tactical ingenuity. Naval warfare and maritime strategy. Naval myths often portray medieval ships as fragile or unsophisticated. However, maritime powers such as Venice, Genoa, and the Hanseatic League deployed fleets with advanced shipbuilding, naval tactics, and logistical planning. Naval engagements involved boarding, ramming, and coordinated missile attacks using archers or early artillery. Surviving shipwrecks and port infrastructure demonstrate the engineering skills needed for long-distance trade and military campaigns alike. Knights and the reality of chivalry. The romanticized image of knights as flawless paragons of honor masks the truth. Medieval knighthood was highly ritualized but also pragmatic. Knights trained rigorously, maintained complex armory, and followed codes of conduct that combined personal honor, loyalty to lords, and strategic acumen. Myths of gallant knights charging recklessly ignore the importance of discipline, battlefield formations, and tactical maneuvering. Accounts from battle chronicles and training manuals reveal a balance between valor and calculated risk. Weapons and armor. The myths of medieval weapons being crude are debunked by surviving artifacts. Swords, polearms, and crossbows were carefully engineered for balance, durability, and effectiveness. Armor was layered and articulated, designed for mobility and protection, and adjusted according to battlefield roles. Archaeometallurgical studies reveal high-quality steel, precise tempering techniques, and regional variations in design. Knights and soldiers relied on both personal skill and technological sophistication. Logistics and supply chains. Medieval warfare required extensive logistical planning, often overlooked in myths. Armies needed food, water, fodder, and medical care, as well as tools for siege operations. Historical records of convoy systems, depots, and contracts show that medieval commanders understood the critical importance of supply chains. The myth that medieval armies starved in the field is partially true in extreme cases, but well-organized campaigns could sustain large forces over extended campaigns through careful planning and resource management. Psychological and information warfare. Legends of medieval battles often focus on heroism, but psychological warfare was vital. Intimidation, misinformation, and displays of power were common tactics. Fortresses were designed to project strength. Banners, heraldry, and ceremonies reinforced morale and deterred enemies. Messengers, scouts, and signal systems allowed rapid communication across battlefields and fortifications. These strategies contradict the myth of medieval combat as primitive or chaotic. Mercenaries and military innovation. Mercenary companies, sometimes portrayed as ruthless and unpredictable, were in fact professional soldiers with specialized skills. They introduced new tactics, weapons, and battlefield strategies across regions, contributing to military evolution. Their contracts, often preserved in archives, revealed disciplined, strategic forces that supplemented feudal levies. The myth that medieval armies relied solely on nobility and peasants ignores this crucial component of military history. Medical support and casualty management. Another overlooked aspect is battlefield medicine. Field surgeons, often attached to armies or monastic hospitals, provided amputations, bandaging, and rudimentary anesthesia with herbs. Archaeological evidence of surgical tools and battlefield graves confirms organized care. The myth that wounded soldiers were left to die in mass is nuanced. While mortality was high, structured medical care and rapid evacuation of the injured were often implemented. Conclusion on medieval warfare. Far from simplistic portrayals in legend and popular culture, medieval warfare involved strategy, technology, and organization. Castles, armies, naval fleets, and knights function within a system of planning, logistics, and innovation that rivals later military periods. Myths surrounding medieval combat, heroism, and chaos often exaggerate, but beneath them lies a reality of discipline, technological advancement, and sophisticated strategy. Understanding these truths reshapes our perception of the Middle Ages as an era not of blind brutality, but of tactical intelligence and human ingenuity. Religion dominated medieval life, shaping morals, governance, art, and daily routines. Myths about the Middle Ages often portray it as a period of blind superstition and oppressive dogma. While faith influenced all aspects of society, research reveals a nuanced picture of religious practice, education, and cultural exchange. Many widely held beliefs about medieval religion are oversimplifications or exaggerations. The power and role of the Church. The Catholic Church, Orthodox Church, and other religious institutions held considerable authority, but their influence extended beyond spiritual matters. The Church operated courts, collected taxes, owned lands, and regulated education. Monastic orders preserved knowledge, copied manuscripts, and maintained libraries. Contrary to myths of a uniformly oppressive institution, monasteries often provided social services, such as health care, hospitality for travelers, and famine relief. Records show charitable foundations, alms distribution, and structured care for the poor, demonstrating organized social responsibility. Pilgrimages and religious travel. Pilgrimages, often romanticized as dangerous or superstitious journeys, were central to spiritual life and cultural exchange. Pilgrims traveled to sacred sites, such as Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, and Jerusalem. Archaeological evidence shows accommodations, roads, and hospitals specifically for pilgrims. These journeys facilitated economic activity, cultural interaction, and knowledge dissemination. The myth that pilgrimages were purely pious or feudal ignores their practical, social, and educational dimensions. Religious festivals and popular devotion. Festivals, processions, and feasts combine devotion with communal celebration. Many myths depict the medieval laity as passive or ignorant, but records reveal participation in education, craft, music, and oral storytelling associated with religious events. Iconography, illuminated manuscripts, and parish records demonstrate that religious celebrations included practical instruction, moral lessons, and social cohesion. The myth of constant fear-driven religiosity overlooks these rich, multifaceted experiences. Heresy and religious dissent. The myth that medieval Europe tolerated no dissent oversimplifies history. Movements such as the Cathars, Lollards, and Hussites challenged established norms, prompting both oppression and debate. Historical documents, trial records, and surviving writings show that dissenters were articulate, organized, and influential in shaping local and regional religious culture. These movements reveal that medieval society negotiated complex questions of faith, authority, and morality rather than blindly obeying dogma. Art, architecture, and religious expression. Cathedrals, churches, and monasteries were centers of artistic innovation. Gothic and Romanesque architecture, stained glass, sculpture, and illuminated manuscripts combined devotion with technical and aesthetic mastery. The myth that medieval religious art was primitive is disproven by surviving structures, which demonstrate engineering sophistication, advanced geometry, and cultural storytelling through symbolism. Religious expression was both spiritual and intellectual, reflecting profound creativity. The role of women in religious life. Women were active participants in religious life, both within convents and in society. Nuns contributed to education, healthcare, manuscript copying, and spiritual guidance. Noble women often founded monasteries or supported charitable institutions. The myth that medieval women were entirely passive in religious affairs ignores their significant contributions to education, healthcare, and culture. Female mystics and visionaries, documented in historical texts, influenced both religious thought and broader society. Interaction with science and philosophy. Contrary to the myth of a strict opposition between faith and reason, medieval religious institutions often fostered intellectual inquiry. Universities and monasteries served as centers for philosophical debate, natural philosophy, and scientific investigation. Figures like Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus worked to reconcile faith and reason, promoting rigorous study while maintaining spiritual devotion. The myth of a purely anti-intellectual church fails to account for this rich interplay between theology and emerging empirical knowledge. Religious rituals and practical knowledge. Many religious rituals, such as fasting, dietary prescriptions, and herbal preparations, serve both spiritual and practical purposes. Monastic medicine, culinary practices, and agricultural advice were often integrated with faith-based directives. The myth of irrationality overlooks the pragmatic components of religious practice. Faith guided moral behavior, but also codified health, labor, and community management in ways that were empirically effective. Conclusion on religion and society. Religion shaped medieval society in profound and multidimensional ways. Far from a period of unthinking superstition, the Middle Ages featured religious institutions that preserved knowledge, promoted social welfare, supported cultural expression, and engaged with science and philosophy. Myths exaggerating fear, ignorance, or oppression obscured the reality of vibrant intellectual, social, and spiritual life. By examining historical evidence, we see a society where faith was interwoven with practical, cultural, and moral frameworks, influencing every aspect of medieval existence. The image of medieval castles as dark, gloomy prisons filled only with royalty and knights is one of the most enduring myths. In reality, castles were dynamic centers of administration, defense, economy, and social life. They were multifunctional complexes that combined military engineering, domestic spaces, and economic hubs. Archaeology, contemporary chronicles, and architectural studies confirm their sophistication and social significance. Design and architecture. Castles were designed according to strategic, environmental, and social considerations. Elevated sites provided natural defense. Moats, drawbridges, and curtain walls added layers of protection. Towers, battlements, and gatehouses allowed defenders to monitor and control movement. Contrary to myths, castles were not uniformly grim or uncomfortable. Many included private chambers, chapels, kitchens, gardens, and halls for feasting and administration. Architectural variation depended on local resources, defensive needs, and the wealth of the owner. Surviving ruins and reconstructions reveal elaborate interior design and functional layouts. Military and defensive function. Castles were not merely symbols of power. They were active defensive structures. Siege tactics like undermining, trebuchets, and scaling ladders challenged castle defenses, prompting constant innovation in design. Archaeological evidence of arrow slits, machicolations, murder holes, and reinforced gates demonstrates the careful planning of defensive architecture. The myth that castles were easy to breach ignores the documented months-long sieges that often ended only due to starvation or negotiation. Economic and administrative centers. Beyond defense, castles function as centers of administration and economic control. Lords collected taxes, managed lands, and dispensed justice from these fortified structures. Craftsmen, blacksmiths, bakers, and servants supported the economic life of the castle. Market activities, storage facilities, and workshops often developed in and around castle complexes. Far from isolated fortresses, castles were hubs for trade, production, and governance. The myth of castles as disconnected military sites is misleading. Domestic life within castles. Life in a castle was socially structured and organized. Nobility, knights, and their households lived in designated quarters, while servants, artisans, and soldiers occupied functional spaces. Kitchens, laundries, and storerooms supported daily life. Archaeological remains reveal extensive use of hearths, ceramic ware, and personal items that illustrate domestic routines. Contrary to myths of dreary existence, many castles provided comfort, social interaction, and cultural activity. Gardens, food, and agriculture. Castles often maintained gardens, orchards, and livestock enclosures to support self-sufficiency. Herbs, vegetables, and fruits were cultivated not only for consumption, but also for medicinal and culinary use. The myth of constant scarcity or monotony in castle life ignores these planned agricultural systems. Castle kitchens could prepare elaborate meals for feasts, reflecting the social and cultural importance of food. Social and cultural life. Entertainment and cultural activity were integral to castle life. Music, poetry, dance, hunting, and tournaments provided both amusement and opportunities to display skill and status. Minstrels and troubadours entertained residents and visiting dignitaries. Education of noble children, training in arms, and instruction in courtly manners were conducted within castle walls. This contradicts the myth of castles as purely militaristic, austere spaces. Women in castles. Women played critical roles in castle administration, social mediation, and cultural life. Noble women managed households, supervised servants, and sometimes acted as regents during the absence of their husbands. Women also contributed to cultural patronage, manuscript copying, and education. The myth that medieval castles were male-dominated fortresses overlooks the influence and agency of women in these spaces. Castles and the surrounding community. Castles were integrated into the broader landscape. Villages, roads, and fields depended on security and governance provided by the castle. Markets and fairs often flourished under castle protection, facilitating trade and economic growth. The myth of castles as isolated fortresses fails to account for their symbiotic relationship with local communities. They served as economic engines, administrative centers, and social focal points. Archaeological confirmation. Excavations across Europe have confirmed much of what historical documents suggest. Foundations, tools, pottery, weapons, and personal items provide tangible evidence of castle life, challenging myths of medieval monotony or brutality. These findings demonstrate that castles were not only military strongholds, but vibrant centers of social, economic, and cultural life. Conclusion on castles and life. Medieval castles were complex, multifunctional spaces that combined defense, governance, domestic life, and culture. Myths portraying them solely as gloomy prisons or military fortresses ignore their rich social, economic, and cultural roles. Understanding castles through archaeology, contemporary accounts, and architectural study reveals a nuanced reality. Medieval castles were living, evolving centers of power and community, far removed from the simplified depictions in folklore and popular imagination. The Middle Ages are often misrepresented as an age of ignorance and superstition, where intellectual life was stagnant and curiosity suppressed. Yet historical evidence, manuscripts, universities, and philosophical treatises reveal a period of remarkable learning, innovation, and critical thought. Myths about medieval intellectual life have been repeatedly challenged by modern scholarship, universities, and centers of learning. The myth that formal education was non-existent outside monasteries is false. Universities such as Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and Salamanca became hubs of higher learning, attracting students from across Europe. These institutions taught law, theology, medicine, philosophy, and the liberal arts. Lecture notes. Disputation records and graduation rolls reveal a structured curriculum, rigorous training, and vibrant academic debate. Students engage in critical reasoning, argumentation, and practical problem solving. Scholars and intellectual exchange. Medieval scholars actively preserved and expanded knowledge from antiquity. Translators in Spain, Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire translated works from Arabic, Greek, and Hebrew into Latin, preserving classical philosophy and science. Figures like Thomas Aquinas, Albertus Magnus, Roger Bacon, and Hildegard of Bingen synthesized empirical observation, logic, and religious thought. The myth of a dark age devoid of intellectual activity ignores these achievements and underestimates the sophistication of medieval scholarship. Libraries and manuscripts. Manuscript production was a major intellectual endeavor. Monks, nuns, and scribes copied texts with remarkable precision, sometimes adding commentary, diagrams, or illustrations. Libraries and monasteries, cathedral schools, and universities contained thousands of works, from theology to astronomy. The myth that books were rare or inaccessible is misleading. Manuscript circulation, commissioned works, and the development of early printing techniques in the late Middle Ages expanded access to knowledge. Science and observation. Contrary to popular belief, medieval scholars engaged in empirical observation. Roger Bacon's writings describe experiments in optics and mechanics, while others studied astronomy, geometry, and natural phenomena. Medical texts incorporated observation of symptoms, botanical remedies, and surgical techniques. The myth that science was entirely suppressed is false. Observation, measurement, and experimentation occurred alongside philosophical and theological study. Philosophy and logic. Logic and philosophy were central to medieval curricula. Scholasticism emphasized rational inquiry, debate, and reconciliation of apparent contradictions in texts. Students learned to construct arguments, evaluate evidence, and develop systematic reasoning. Figures like Peter Abelard advanced methods of questioning authority, analyzing language, and applying logic to ethics and theology. The myth of unquestioning dogma overlooks the rigorous intellectual methods employed across Europe. Mathematics and engineering. Medieval mathematicians studied arithmetic, geometry, and algebra. Techniques from the Islamic world, including decimal notation and algorithms, were introduced to Europe and applied in commerce, architecture, and navigation. Engineering feats, including bridges, watermills, siege engines, and cathedrals, demonstrate practical application of mathematical principles. The myth of technological backwardness is contradicted by these tangible accomplishments. Medicine and natural philosophy. As previously discussed, medieval medicine was empirical in many respects. Physicians, herbalists, and scholars combined classical knowledge with observation. Natural philosophy involved careful study of the environment, the human body, and the cosmos. Contrary to the myth of blind superstition, observation, classification, and experimentation were integral to understanding natural phenomena. Literature and the vernacular. Literacy expanded beyond clerical elites. Vernacular literature, including poetry, epics, chronicles, and instructional texts, flourished. Works such as Dante's Divine Comedy, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and the Arthurian romances reveal rich narrative, moral reasoning, and social commentary. The myth that medieval culture was exclusively Latin or clerical ignores the vibrancy of local languages and storytelling traditions. Education of women. While women's access to formal universities was limited, many received education in convents, noble households, or through private tutors. Women such as Hildegard of Bingen, Christine de Pizan, and Eleanor of Aquitaine made lasting contributions to philosophy, literature, and cultural life. The myth of women as entirely uneducated is contradicted by historical evidence of literacy, artistic production, and intellectual influence. Preservation and transmission of knowledge. Medieval scholarship preserved classical works, integrated diverse cultural perspectives, and laid foundations for the Renaissance. Far from a period of stagnation, it represented a dynamic process of accumulation, synthesis, and innovation. The myth of the Dark Ages, as intellectually barren, obscures the reality of society engaged in inquiry, education, and cultural production. Conclusion on medieval learning. The Middle Ages were an era of intellectual vitality, cross-cultural exchange, and critical inquiry. Universities, libraries, manuscript production, science, and philosophy demonstrate that myths of ignorance and stagnation are false. Education, observation, logic, and experimentation flourished alongside religious devotion, creating a multifaceted intellectual landscape that shaped Europe's future. While myths often portrayed a medieval period as dominated entirely by knights, castles, and kings, the reality of daily life for common people was complex, structured, and culturally rich. Peasants, artisans, merchants, and townspeople lived within social frameworks, following customs, laws, and traditions that shaped their economic, familial, and spiritual lives. Housing and living conditions. Contrary to the myth that all medieval people lived in dark, dirty huts, housing varied widely depending on status, wealth, and location. Peasant homes often had timber frames, wattle and daub walls, thatched roofs, and central hearths. Wealthier villagers and townspeople could afford stone houses with multiple rooms and workshops. Inside, families managed storage, cooking, and sleeping arrangements efficiently. Archaeological excavations reveal organized domestic spaces, utensils, pottery, and textiles, illustrating an active domestic culture. Work and occupations. Daily life revolved around labor, but work was structured, diverse, and specialized. Farmers cultivated crops such as wheat, barley, rye, and vegetables while tending livestock. Artisans produced tools, clothing, pottery, and furniture. Markets facilitated trade, allowing goods and services to circulate efficiently. Guilds organized skilled labor in towns, regulating quality, training apprentices, and protecting economic interests. Myths of unskilled, idle peasants are contradicted by records showing rigorous work schedules, seasonal rhythms, and communal cooperation. Food, diet, and culinary practices. The myth that medieval people ate only bread and gruel is simplistic. Diets were diverse and adapted to local environments, seasons, and resources. Peasants consumed grains, legumes, vegetables, fruits, eggs, dairy, and occasional meat or fish. Wealthier classes enjoyed spice meats, pastries, wine, and imported delicacies. Cooking techniques included boiling, roasting, baking, and fermenting. Archaeobotanical evidence, kitchen implements, and written recipes confirm sophisticated knowledge of preservation, flavoring, and nutrition. Clothing and personal appearance. Medieval clothing was functional, status indicative, and influenced by climate. Peasants wore wool, linen, and simple tunics, while wealthier citizens and nobles displayed elaborate fabrics, dyes, and jewelry. Seasonal and occupational considerations influenced material choice and garment design. The myth of universal squalor ignores evidence of textile production, dyeing techniques, embroidery, and regulated sumptuary laws that shaped dress according to social rank. Family and social structures. Medieval families were central to economic and social organization. Households often included extended family, servants, and apprentices. Marriages were negotiated for alliances, property, and social stability. Children contributed to labor from an early age, while education and apprenticeship provided skills for future roles. Community life included mutual aid, cooperative farming, and participation in festivals and local rituals. Myths portraying medieval society as harshly individualistic fail to capture these networks of interdependence. Religion and daily life. Faith influenced daily routines profoundly. Attendance at church, observance of saints' days, and participation in local rituals structured the calendar. Religious practice blended spiritual devotion with practical guidance, such as fasting for health, prayer for protection, and charity for social cohesion. Archaeological evidence of chapels, shrines, and religious artifacts in homes and villages shows integration of faith into everyday life. The myth of rigid, oppressive religiosity is nuanced. Religion also provided community, guidance, and practical benefits. Education and literacy. While literacy rates were low, education was not absent. Monastic schools, cathedral schools, and private tutors provided basic reading, writing, and numeracy skills. Apprenticeships imparted vocational knowledge. Documents and inscriptions show that many peasants and townspeople could engage with written records, contracts, and local legal documents. The myth that medieval commoners were entirely illiterate ignores these pragmatic forms of literacy. Health and medicine. Access to medical knowledge varied, but herbal remedies, midwives, and local healers played key roles in maintaining health. Communities shared practical knowledge of diet, hygiene, and treatment. Evidence from archaeological finds, such as medicinal plants, tools, and textual guides, shows that medieval medicine, while limited, was practical and informed. The myth of pervasive helplessness during illness overlooks these adaptive, community-based systems of care. Leisure, festivals, and culture. Contrary to the idea of a joyless peasantry, medieval life included leisure, storytelling, music, dancing, fairs, and games. Seasonal celebrations, religious festivals, and market days allowed communal gathering, entertainment, and expression of local identity. Archaeological finds of musical instruments, board games, dice, and artwork confirm that recreation was widespread, creative, and culturally significant. Urban life and trade. Towns were centers of commerce, craft, and cultural exchange. Markets, guilds, and fairs facilitated trade of local and imported goods. Urban residents enjoyed access to services, education, and entertainment. Contrary to myths of medieval towns as filthy and lawless, records show urban planning, sanitation efforts, law enforcement, and structured trade practices. Conclusion on daily life. Daily life in the Middle Ages was diverse, structured, and culturally rich. Peasants, artisans, merchants, and townspeople engage in work, faith, education, leisure, and community in ways that challenge simplistic myths of ignorance, squalor, and monotony. Through archaeological evidence, written records, and historical analysis, we see that medieval society was adaptive, complex, and socially organized, providing a vibrant backdrop to more widely studied elite and military narratives. Medieval warfare is often dramatized as a chaotic, brutal, and mindless series of battles dominated by knights on horseback. Popular myths exaggerate the dominance of chivalric knights, the use of swords alone, or the simplicity of military organization. Historical research and archaeological evidence reveal a more complex and structured reality of strategy, logistics, and combat. Military organization and hierarchy. Medieval armies were organized hierarchically, with clear ranks, roles, and responsibilities. Kings and lords led forces, but the majority of soldiers were commoners conscripted or hired as foot soldiers. Specialists such as archers, engineers, and siege operators played crucial roles. Records show structured chains of command, supply coordination, and tactical planning. The myth of armies as disorganized mobs ignores the logistical sophistication required for sustained campaigns, particularly during sieges or extended field operations. Siege warfare and fortifications. Sieges were a dominant feature of medieval warfare, challenging myths of quick, decisive battles. Attackers employed catapults, trebuchets, battering rams, and mining to breach walls, while defenders used machicolations, arrow slits, and counter-mining techniques. Archaeological evidence confirms the use of tunnels, reinforced walls, and complex fortification designs. The myth that castles were easily overrun ignores months-long sieges that tested endurance, engineering, and strategy. Weapons and armor. The popular image of knights clad in shining plate armor fighting solely with swords oversimplifies reality. Armor varied by region, era, and rank, including chainmail, brigandine, leather, and partial plate. Weapons included spears, polearms, crossbows, longbows, maces, and siege engines. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated the effectiveness and limitations of medieval armor and weapons, challenging myths of invincibility. Combat required skill, coordination, and strategic use of resources, not mere brute force. Tactics and strategy. Medieval commanders employed advanced tactics, including flanking, feigned retreats, defensive formations, and coordinated assaults. Battles often involved reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, and psychological warfare. Chroniclers and military manuals document the careful planning required for campaigns, contradicting myths that medieval warfare was purely chaotic or improvised. Naval warfare. Seafaring combat played a crucial role in medieval power struggles, particularly in the Mediterranean and North Sea. Ships were equipped with archers, catapults, and boarding parties. Ports, harbors, and naval logistics were vital for supply and control of trade routes. The myth that medieval Europe lacked maritime sophistication is disproven by evidence of shipbuilding techniques, naval strategy, and international trade conducted by maritime powers such as Venice, Genoa, and the Hanseatic League. Cavalry and the role of knights. Knights were elite warriors, but their effectiveness depended on coordination with infantry, archers, and support units. Heavy cavalry could dominate certain engagements but was vulnerable to terrain, disciplined foot soldiers, and missile fire. The myth of knights as invincible lone combatants is misleading, Successful warfare required combined arms tactics, strategic foresight, and disciplined training. Siege weapons and engineering. Engineering innovations were critical. Trebuchets could hurl stones over great distances, while ballistae and mangonels provided precision strikes. Defenders used counterweights, traps, and improvised artillery. The myth of medieval technology as primitive is challenged by surviving siege engines, manuscripts, and experimental reconstructions demonstrating advanced engineering knowledge. Mercenaries and professional soldiers. Not all warriors were nobility. Mercenaries, town militias, and professional soldiers formed significant parts of armies. Contracts, pay records, and chronicles document their recruitment duties and influence on campaigns. This counters myths portraying medieval combat as solely aristocratic or feudal. Commoners often played decisive roles in warfare. Logistics, supply, and communication. Armies relied on extensive supply networks for food, weapons, and equipment. Communication via messengers, signal fires, and mounted couriers coordinated movements across distances. Historical records reveal careful planning for campaigns, including storage, rationing, and reinforcement, challenging myths that medieval warfare was purely chaotic. Psychology and morale. Medieval commanders understood morale, leadership, and psychological tactics. Displaying strength, signaling reinforcements, or spreading rumors could influence enemy decisions. Siege warfare often involved intimidation, negotiation, and psychological pressure as much as combat. The myth of medieval soldiers fighting blindly overlooks their awareness of strategy, motivation, and group cohesion. Conclusion on medieval warfare. Medieval warfare was structured, strategic, and sophisticated. Armies relied on organization, technology, coordination, and adaptability. Myths portraying combat as purely chaotic, romanticized, or dominated solely by knights are contradicted by historical and archaeological evidence. Understanding warfare in its full context reveals a world of ingenuity, discipline, and tactical complexity that underpin the social and political structures of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages have long been shrouded in myth. Popular culture often depicts knights, castles, and black-robed monks, while ignoring the social complexity, intellectual achievements, and cultural richness of the period. Modern historical research, archaeology, and interdisciplinary studies have corrected many misconceptions, revealing a multifaceted era with enduring influence on subsequent centuries. Debunking historical myths. Countless myths surround the medieval period. The Dark Ages myth. Contrary to the idea of intellectual stagnation, the Middle Ages were marked by universities, scientific inquiry, and philosophical debate. Translation movements preserved classical texts, while innovation in engineering, medicine, and astronomy laid the groundwork for the Renaissance. The brutal peasantry myth. Peasants were not universally oppressed, ignorant, or idle. Archaeological evidence shows organized domestic life, skilled agricultural practice, and participation in communal activities. Guilds, fairs, and local governance created structured social frameworks. The invincible knight myth. Knights were elite warriors, but medieval warfare relied on strategy, coordination, and the integration of infantry, archers, and siege engines. Armor and weaponry were sophisticated yet imperfect, and success depended on training, terrain, and morale. The superstitious society myth. While religion influenced daily life, medieval Europeans engaged in empirical observation, medicine, and rational thought. Monasteries, universities, and scholars promoted learning and experimentation. The isolated castle myth. Castles were not simply defensive fortresses. They were centers of administration, trade, culture, and social life. Nobility, artisan, and servants lived in organized, functioning communities within and around castles. Intellectual legacy. Medieval intellectual achievements shaped the modern world. Scholastic philosophy developed methods of logic, argumentation, and synthesis that influenced later European thought. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering advanced significantly through study, experimentation, and cross-cultural exchange. The preservation and dissemination of knowledge during this period enabled the Renaissance, Enlightenment, and the scientific revolution. The myth of medieval intellectual darkness is disproven by manuscripts, treatises, and educational institutions that endured for centuries. Cultural achievements. Literature, art, and music flourished across Europe. Epic poetry, vernacular chronicles, illuminated manuscripts, and cathedrals reflect the cultural sophistication of medieval societies. Festivals, games, and communal rituals strengthened social cohesion and transmitted cultural knowledge. Women, often overlooked, contributed significantly to culture, education, and religious life. Figures such as Hildegard of Bingen, Christine de Pizan, and Eleanor of Aquitaine exemplify the intellectual and creative agency of women in the medieval period. Social structures and governance. Feudalism provided a framework for social organization, integrating lords, vassals, and peasants into mutually dependent relationships. Local governance, communal labor, and cooperative economies allowed society to function efficiently despite geographic and political fragmentation. Historical evidence shows that medieval legal codes, municipal charters, and councils created systems of accountability, rights, and dispute resolution, challenging myths of universal chaos or oppression. Science, medicine, and technology. Medieval science was empirical, integrated with philosophy and religion, and often practical. Hospitals, medical texts, herbal remedies, and surgical tools reveal sophisticated understanding of human anatomy, disease, and treatment. Engineering feats, including bridges, mills, water management systems, and fortifications, demonstrate applied scientific knowledge. The myth that medieval people ignored empirical observation is disproven by surviving artifacts, manuscripts, and technological achievements. Economic life. Trade, crafts, and markets were vital to medieval economies. Guilds regulated quality, trained apprentices, and maintained standards. Urban centers facilitated exchange of goods, ideas, and cultural practices. Far from static or primitive, medieval economies were dynamic, adaptive, and connected across regions. The myth of medieval poverty as universal neglects the evidence of wealth distribution, craft specialization, and social mobility within towns and estates. Religion, philosophy, and morality. Religion shaped ethics, law, education, and daily routines. However, medieval thought integrated faith with reason. Scholastic philosophy sought to reconcile human understanding with divine law, promoting moral reasoning, justice, and intellectual engagement. Rituals, celebrations, and festivals created cohesion, while also supporting practical knowledge in health, agriculture, and community life. The myth of oppressive superstition ignores the nuanced role of religion as both spiritual and pragmatic. Military and strategy. Military organization was hierarchical and strategic. Armies relied on logistics, communication, intelligence, and tactical planning. Castles, fortifications, siege engines, and naval power reflect engineering and strategic sophistication. The myth of mindless, endless violence underestimates the complex interplay of planning, negotiation, and skill that defined medieval warfare. The transmission of knowledge. The medieval period served as a bridge between antiquity and the modern world. Preservation of classical texts, translation movements, and educational institutions ensured that knowledge was transmitted across generations. Scientific, artistic, and philosophical ideas spread through manuscripts, oral instruction, and trade networks, influencing the Renaissance and beyond. Legacy and influence. The Middle Ages shaped Europe and the world in ways often unrecognized. Intellectual achievements, cultural production, social structures, and technological innovations had lasting impact. The myths that obscure this history are gradually replaced by evidence-based understanding. By correcting misconceptions, historians reveal a society capable of complexity, creativity, and resilience. The medieval period was not merely a prelude to modernity, but a foundation upon which modern intellectual, cultural, and social life was built. Conclusion: reassessing the Middle Ages. Through rigorous research, archaeology, and critical historical analysis, the myths surrounding the Middle Ages are increasingly challenged. The era was a tapestry of intellectual vitality, cultural richness, strategic innovation, and social complexity. The legacy of the medieval world endures in universities, architecture, literature, philosophy, governance, and technology. Far from a dark age, it was a period of learning, adaptation, and creativity whose influence extends into the present day. In understanding the Middle Ages accurately, we honor the ingenuity, resilience, and achievement of those who lived centuries ago, restoring their place in history beyond myth and legend.